Someone just asked a really clever question.
Sure.
They asked whether there's a correlation between unconscious bias and emotional intelligence.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, I'm not a psychologist, but definitely there is a correlation. But I think sometimes people have a negative perception of, I think emotional intelligence is as important as intellectual intelligence or analytical ability. I think personally, I think it's very important, but some people think of emotional intelligence as a bit like kind of touchy feeling, soft thing, you know, it's not data-based, it's all about feelings. I don't think, I don't feel personally negative about emotional intelligence. I think it is a very important aspect of intelligence. You know, you've got your analytical intelligence, your ability to analyze data, kind of database solutions, problem solving, all of that. But then having that emotional intelligence, especially if you're in a leadership position, is really, really important. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now with COVID about the increasing importance of, for example, compassionate leadership, and how this inclusive and compassionate leadership is going to become a very, very important skill moving forward. And I think definitely there is a correlation, because by acknowledging unconscious bias, and by acknowledging that unconscious bias is an emotional response, and then you need to understand where it comes from, and then you can control much better how your reactions overtake you sometime. I think that that is part of emotional intelligence. I would say that they go hand in hand. Yes. But that's not to say that bias is an intangible thing. I mean, it's proven and supported by data that unconscious bias is a real thing. There's something else here. Lack of cultural fit judgment. Yes, we will talk about interviews and recruitment processes. Definitely, it's a systemic thing, and it starts very much in organizations. It starts very much from the moment they put the role profile, the job description together. Already, some of the biases come into play at that very early stage of recruitment, and then all throughout all the stages. So, you know, when companies put the role profile together, the job description, by already saying, you know, competitive, we're looking for a competitive individual, or we're looking for, you know, strong-minded individual. You know, when companies put those strong charged emotional words into the role profile, already the bias is coming into play. You're already excluding a lot of people by saying those things. Right. Thank you for your comments. A lot of thinking. Shall we move on? Are you happy to move on? Yes. Jennifer, you're always very quick with a chat. Yes. Right. So let's look at certain, thank you guys. Oh, thank you. Let's look at certain types of biases. I mean, there's, I think, almost 200 officially categorized types of unconscious biases, which obviously we don't have time to go through. So what I've done is pick about 1, 2, 3, 5. I've picked about 5 well-known types of biases that I think are quite common in the workplace, and that I'm pretty sure that most of you will have experienced yourselves. So let's start with the first one. The first one is called the affinity bias. And from the image, anyone would like to say what you think this bias is all about?
Having a moustache.
Yeah. And what is it all about? What is that moustache all about, you think?
The need to fit in there in that image.
The need to fit in. Someone said status. Anything else you think? What do you think is happening there? Who thinks need to fit in? What's happening in that cartoon, you think? You can put it in the chat if you're too shy. They all look the same. Exactly. Yeah. Preference for you, what you can see yourself in. You can relate better to something you're familiar with. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the key here is that they all look the same. And this is such a common bias in the sense that we tend as individuals to feel more comfortable with people who are like us, like me, okay? And when I say like me, that can mean many, many things. So in a work environment, people who are like us, it could be people, you know, who are same gender. It could be people who are the same race. It could be people who have similar educational background. You know, look at the politicians in the UK at the moment in power. They all went to the same schools, private schools. They all went to Oxford and Cambridge, you know, elite schools. You know, they're all chummy, they're all similar. And this happens very often in companies where, and you know, it happens in life, right? It's very natural that we tend to be attracted or feel more comfortable with people who are like us. But that in a work environment can be quite dangerous. So for example, in this cartoon, yeah, Boris and Boris and Donald have the same hair. Yeah, people with the same hair, you know, same kind of thing. It's very, in this cartoon particularly, what's happening here is like you have a panel, a selection panel at an interview. And you can see that the panel that makes the decision is not very diverse. They all look the same. And of course, the moment a candidate walks in looking the same, immediately they're saying, we like the look of you. I mean, of course, it is a joke, but you can just see how this translates into real life. I mean, I was sharing this example last week when we had the session, but you know, as I said, I come from Spain, right? So I was born in Spain, I grew up in Spain. I only left Spain when I was 19. So, you know, all my childhood and adolescence, I was in Spain. My mother language is Spanish. I've worked with the British Council now for 22 years, for a long time. And because of my job, I have to go to a lot of social events, you know, receptions, you know, launches, parties, whatever. And the first event I attended here when I arrived in June was the Queen's birthday party, which is the equivalent of the UK National Day. And I was invited to a reception in Pretoria at the High Commissioner's residence. There were like 500 guests there in the garden, beautiful, you know. It was my first event in my new job in South Africa. And as I was in that reception, after about an hour and a half of being there, I realized that I had spent all the time I had been there with a group of Spanish-speaking people. You know, the Spanish ambassador, the Italian ambassador who could speak Spanish, a couple of ambassadors from Latin America, the guy from Portugal who could also speak Spanish. So I look around me and I was thinking, oh my goodness, I spent all the time here talking to a bunch of Spanish-speaking people, which is great. It was very nice. I had fun. But then I thought, this is not really great because I'm not here. I'm not supposed to be hanging out with a group of Spanish-speaking people. So I was quite conscious of my own comfort zone, my own affinity bias, which is I feel comfortable with people who speak the same language as me. And that comfort can be quite dangerous because it's not pushing me out of my comfort zone. And that's what affinity bias is about. And of course, if you're a decision maker in your work environment, that can be quite dangerous because you're excluding people who you deem to be different from you. Okay? Does that make sense?
There were two comments raised in the last minute, and one says, well, you know, affinity bias, isn't it natural that we all have affinity bias because it makes us feel comfortable around certain people, who reflect who we are. And the other interesting question was, doesn't bias lead to nepotism?
Yeah, of course. Yes. I mean, you see it all the time. You see it in companies, you see it in politics. You see it in everyday life. I mean, you know, when I worked in Burma, we were looking for a supply. We had to refurbish our library. We had a library service. We had to refurbish the library. And the person who was the librarian, the library manager, she was in charge of all the decision making. And we have quite strict procurement processes, but she managed to cut some corners. And in the end, it came to 2 suppliers. And there were, on paper, they were both equally okay, but one supplier was run by a Muslim guy, and the other supplier was run by a Buddhist guy. And she chose the supplier entirely based on religion, because, you know, in Burma, there's a lot of religious conflict. And she just discarded the Muslim supplier altogether, just because she didn't want to have a Muslim person doing the library. And then when it came to our attention, this is completely against our values in the organization, but that's a clear case of when bias leads to nepotism. Yeah, absolutely. It's clearly linked. And in terms of, yes, of course, it is natural to be comfortable with people who are like us. But for example, the example on the reception, if I was in a party, right, with friends in a social environment, it's completely fine. I'm comfortable with Spanish people. We have the same culture, we speak the same language, it's fun, you know, I love it. The question is, for me in that context, I had to be quite conscious that that was not the right thing to do for me in that situation. You know, as country director of the British Council, South Africa, I'm not in that reception to be in my comfort zone with a bunch of Spanish people. I have to push myself to make contacts, to network, to get to meet, you know, people from all the other people who were in that party. So I think it's okay to be comfortable. The question is realizing your own comfort zones and when it's important for you to push yourself out of those comfort zones. That's the key. It doesn't mean that you have to be like, oh my God, I can't talk to my own people because I'm biased. No, that's fine. It's completely natural. But there are circumstances and contexts when it might not be the best thing to do. Thank you. Let's move to the next one, because the next one is kind of related to affinity bias. So they're not really that far off. I mean, anyone would like to have a go and see what you think this one means?
It just looks like they're sticking to each other. So the Muslim ladies are sticking together close to each other, and the couple's just sitting there looking like they're waiting for a bus or something, or maybe they're in a park.
Yeah. Okay, so it's obviously, you know, there's 2 obvious groups of people there, right? The Muslim ladies with a headscarf and the white elderly couple on the other side, and there seems to be quite a separation between them. They all look uncomfortable. Is this still not sticking to what you know or who you know?
Actually, the guy could move his bag and make space for the lady to actually sit on the chair if he was really polite.
Yeah. I mean, sure, there's lots of things there. Yeah, you know, it could be, yeah, as you say, there's one standing up and someone could give the seat. I mean, there's a lot of analysis that people put into this image. The key question in relation to what comparison bias means, it's related to the previous one, okay? So when we talked about affinity bias, what we said is that we are comfortable, naturally we are more comfortable with people who are like us, right? And that could be lots of different categories. By default, comparison bias is kind of pushing away difference. And because when we say people who are not like us, that means they are different. And because we tend to gravitate away from people who are different, then we tend to exaggerate the difference, okay? So that's what comparison bias is about. So in a work environment, as we said, you know, we tend to be more comfortable with people, and it can be quite dangerous because it can lead to wrong decisions. This means that sometimes, because we are, let's think, you remember the first image I put on the presentation, you know, the boardroom, black and white photo, big boardroom, and there was all men, white men, and just one woman in that photo. So imagine that in a real situation, right? The affinity bias would be all the white men, they feel quite comfortable with each other. We're all men, you know, in our suits, we're all white, you know, we're comfortable with each other. And then you just have one woman in that meeting room, okay? You've got like, I don't know, it was a big room, wasn't it? So you could have like 20 men and one woman. The person who is not like the others is the woman. And the dynamics in situations like that can be quite silencing for people who are the different ones. In this case, the woman. It could be, being different could be many, many things, okay? You could be a situation where the person who is different could be a person with a disability in a wheelchair, and everyone else is able-bodied. It could be age-related. You know, you could have a team that is all very young and, you know, they're all into the latest things, Instagram and social media. And then you have a member of the team who is older and feels they don't fit in. They're a little bit excluded. So the difference and the like me, they kind of interact. And it's normally the people who are in the not like me groups that tend to feel excluded, they feel silenced, or sometimes they cannot even be part of the group at all because they don't get recruited into the companies to start with. And this is what comparison bias is about. It's about, you're not like me, you're different, and I tend to exaggerate the difference a little bit. You know, this is where sometimes dangerous stereotypes come into play. So for example, me let's say as a Spanish woman, there is this perception that Spanish people are lazy, you know. If you talk to any American, they don't even know where Spain is. When I say I'm Spanish, they think I'm Mexican. You know, I've met so many Americans. And when they say, where are you from? Spain? Oh, Mexico, I've been to Tijuana, it's great, you know, bias. But, you know, a lot of perception about Spanish people or Latin American people, oh, they're lazy, you know, they're a bit lazy, you know. And those biases can be very, very dangerous. Because, for example, I could be applying for a job and I could be competing against a non-Latin or not Hispanic male, and I could be much better qualified, but those biases could really play against me. And then he gets the job, I don't get the job. It happens all the time. Someone said, it's true. I think culture has a lot to do with it. We can just be normal people, just people, but due to a certain culture, people have to be treated differently. Yes, culture plays a role. And as I said, it's impossible to eliminate bias, okay? I think you have to be very clear that it's impossible to eliminate bias, but it is possible to make a conscious effort to manage it and counteract it. And we will talk about it in a little bit. Next one, confirmation bias. I love this cartoon. It's kind of explained there, but anyone would like to say something about this one? Authoritative bias. We make decisions based on what we have already decided about them, and more so ourselves. Yes, Ina, is that how you pronounce your name? Ina, do you want to elaborate on that? Would you be happy to say something about that?
And I think sometimes we just have our own emotional biases or preconceptions about ourselves, that when we get into situations, doesn't matter what the other person says, you interpret it in a negative or a positive way based on how you started off that discussion. So that's what I meant by.
Yeah, absolutely. It's totally right. And what Slindilia said after you, it confirms that and it reinforces that. It's about when you have perceptions about people and then you just look for signs to kind of confirm what you know or what you think. And in this cartoon, it's very obvious, right? That's the case. You know, a meeting starts and the lady on the right has already made up her mind about the person on the left. And no matter what that person does, she will think it's just evidence of what she already thinks about that person. So it's a bit of a no-win situation. And sometimes that happens for real. I mean, who hasn't experienced this in a work environment or in school when we went to school? You know, sometimes you have the teacher and the teacher doesn't like you, and no matter what you do, the teacher will always find ways to confirm what she thinks or he thinks of you. So that's confirmation bias. It's about, you know, looking for evidence that is actually not there to confirm your judgment about a particular person. And of course, in a work environment, this can lead to a lot of unpleasant situations, and worse, it can lead to unfairness, unfair treatment of people. Yes, I mean, have you ever experienced this with a line manager, for example, or even with people you manage yourself? It does happen a lot. Let me see the comments. People will gravitate towards their own perception of themselves. Even if the information presented is factual and evident, a person will only accept the parts that are applicable to themselves and disregard everything else. Yes, and that's a different type of bias that I didn't include in this list because I'm worried about time, but that's called attribution bias. It's called attribution bias. It's when you attribute, let's say, positive values on you and your group, and even if the data is telling you something very, very different, you will still reflect on those positive values you have attributed to you and your group. So that's a particular type of bias. It's called attribution. Yeah. Let's look at the next.